December 19th, 1944. A converted French barracks in Verdun. The room was filled with the most powerful military commanders in the Western world, and every single one of them looked afraid. 3 days earlier, over 200,000 German soldiers had smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest in a massive surprise offensive that threatened to split the entire Allied front in half. The 101st Airborne Division was trapped in Bastogne, surrounded, running out of ammunition, and facing annihilation. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower looked around the table and asked the question everyone dreaded. When can we counterattack to relieve Bastogne? Heavy silence. Generals were doing mental calculations, moving armies in winter through snow and ice, disengaging from current combat, repositioning hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles. Weeks, maybe a month if everything went perfectly. Then George S. Patton spoke. 48 hours. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. The room thought he'd lost his mind. Moving an entire army corps 100 miles through a blizzard and attacking prepared German defences in 2 days wasn't just difficult. It was physically impossible by every standard of military logistics. Except Patton wasn't guessing. He wasn't being optimistic. He'd been preparing for exactly this moment for 11 days. While every other Allied commander had been caught completely off guard by the German offensive, December 9th, 1944. 11 days before the German attack, Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence officer, walked into Patton's office with a file that would change everything. Koch was methodical, careful, not given to dramatics or exaggeration, which made what he said next even more significant. General, we have a problem. 15 German divisions have disappeared from the front. Patton looked up from his maps. 15 divisions. That's over 200,000 men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, entire armies' worth of combat power. Gone. Koch continued. Allied intelligence at Supreme Headquarters assumed these divisions had been pulled back as strategic reserves, broken units being rebuilt far from the front. Koch disagreed. His analysis showed these weren't broken units. They were full-strength divisions, including elite panzer formations, and they weren't scattered in rear areas. They were concentrating in the Ardennes. The same Ardennes forest where German forces had broken through French lines in 1940, starting the conquest of France. The same terrain everyone considered impassable for armour, which made it perfect for a surprise attack. Koch laid out the evidence. Radio intercepts showing unusual patterns of communication, reports from prisoners of war describing nighttime movements of armour, civilian intelligence from French resistance noting increased German activity. Everything pointed to a major offensive being prepared, and Koch's timeline was precise. The attack would come within 2 weeks. Patton listened to Koch's briefing and faced a decision that would define the next month of warfare. He could believe official Allied intelligence from Supreme Headquarters, which said the Germans were finished, the war was essentially won, and any talk of major German offensives was paranoid fantasy. Or he could believe his own intelligence officer, who was telling him the opposite. The institutional pressure to dismiss Koch's warnings was enormous. General Omar Bradley, commanding all American ground forces, had been briefed on similar intelligence and rejected it. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force intelligence assessed German capability as exhausted. The prevailing narrative throughout Allied command was that Germany was on its last legs, barely able to defend, certainly incapable of major offensive operations. Allied commanders were planning victory parades, not defensive battles. Koch was saying they were all wrong, that the Germans were about to launch the biggest offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. And he was predicting it would hit in the Ardennes, the one sector where Allied forces were stretched thinnest, with inexperienced divisions holding long frontages because commanders assumed nothing would happen there. Patton made his choice. He believed Koch. Not because Koch was telling him what he wanted to hear. The prediction was actually terrible news. But because Koch's analysis was thorough, evidence-based, and logically sound, Patton had worked with Koch long enough to trust his judgment. So Patton did something that no other Allied commander did. He started preparing for an attack everyone else said was impossible. The preparation had to be quiet. Patton couldn't openly contradict Supreme Headquarters intelligence assessments without evidence they'd accept, and he couldn't divert significant resources from his ongoing offensive operations without triggering questions from Bradley and Eisenhower. So the planning happened in the background, known only to Patton's immediate staff. Koch identified 3 likely scenarios based on where the German offensive might strike and what its objectives could be. Patton's operations officers developed 3 corresponding contingency plans: Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. Each plan detailed exactly how the Third Army would disengage from current combat operations, pivot 90 degrees from attacking east toward Germany to attacking north into the Ardennes, and relieve American forces under attack. The planning was extraordinarily detailed. Specific truck routes calculated to move divisions without creating traffic jams, fuel dumps pre-positioned along likely approach routes, artillery positions identified and surveyed, infantry staging areas selected, timeline requirements calculated down to the hour for how long each phase would take. This wasn't generic contingency planning. This was operational preparation for a specific, imminent threat that only Patton's command believed was real. Some of Patton's staff officers questioned the wisdom of diverting planning resources to prepare for something that official intelligence said wouldn't happen. Patton didn't explain. He just ordered the work to continue. By December 15th, while the rest of the Allied command focused on advancing toward Germany and planning how to cross the Rhine River in the spring, Patton's Third Army stood uniquely prepared with detailed plans to pivot and counterattack a German offensive that officially didn't exist. The contrast was stark. At Supreme Headquarters, intelligence officers were dismissing reports of German armour movements as local repositioning. At Bradley's headquarters, commanders were focused on supply logistics for continued eastward advances. At Patton's headquarters, staff officers were finalising routes for a massive northward redeployment to counter an attack that would hit the Ardennes within days. When the attack came, only one Allied command would be ready. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours. German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. Over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by hundreds of tanks and assault guns, attacked 4 overextended American divisions. The scale was massive. The surprise was total, or almost total. At Supreme Headquarters, initial reports were dismissed as a local counterattack. Bradley's headquarters took hours to recognize the scale of the offensive. Across the Ardennes, American units were being shattered. The 106th Infantry Division, Green troops newly arrived in theatre, collapsed. 2 entire regiments, over 8,000 men, were surrounded and forced to surrender, the largest mass capitulation of US forces in the European theatre. Chaos spread as German spearheads penetrated deeper. Communications broke down. Units retreated in confusion. The entire Allied front seemed on the verge of collapse. At Third Army headquarters, Patton received the first reports and wasn't surprised. He immediately called for Koch. "Where are they going?" Koch had the answer ready. "Bastogne." The small Belgian town was a critical road junction. 7 major roads converged there. Control Bastogne and the Germans could push to the Meuse River, potentially reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. Lose Bastogne and the German offensive might succeed in its strategic objectives. Patton made the call instantly. Activate the contingency plans. While other Allied commands were still trying to understand what was happening, Patton's Third Army began executing operations planned 11 days earlier. Staff officers pulled out the prepared plans. Communications officers sent coded messages to division commanders. Logistics officers began moving pre-positioned fuel and ammunition. The machine Patton had built in secret started operating. By the time Bradley's headquarters fully grasped the scale of the German attack, Patton's forces were already beginning to disengage from their current operations and reorient northward. The 11 days of preparation were about to pay dividends that would save thousands of American lives. But first, Patton had to convince Eisenhower that what he was promising wasn't insane. December 19th, back to Verdun. The meeting Eisenhower called was tense with barely controlled panic. The German offensive had been rolling for 3 days. The 101st Airborne was surrounded in Bastogne. American casualties were mounting. The strategic situation was dire. But Eisenhower saw something others didn't. Yes, the Germans had attacked. But in doing so, they'd exposed themselves. They'd pushed forward into a bulge in Allied lines, hence the name Battle of the Bulge, with flanks vulnerable to counterattack. If the Allies could hit those flanks hard and fast, they could turn German success into catastrophic defeat. The key was speed. Attack too slowly and Germans would consolidate. Attack quickly and catch them overextended. Eisenhower asked when counterattack was possible. Generals around the table discussed the practical challenges. Weather was terrible, roads were iced over, supply lines needed adjustment, units needed time to regroup. The consensus was forming around launching a counter-offensive in a week to 10 days. Then Patton said 48 hours. The room reacted like he'd suggested something physically impossible. Omar Bradley, who knew Patton well, thought he was grandstanding. British commanders who'd heard about Patton's ego thought he was making promises he couldn't keep. Even Eisenhower, who valued Patton's aggressiveness, was skeptical. Moving 2 divisions 100 miles through winter conditions while simultaneously fighting German attacks. In 2 days. This wasn't optimism. This was fantasy. Eisenhower pressed Patton directly. George, the 101st is surrounded. They have ammunition for maybe 3 or 4 more days. If you promise relief in 48 hours and fail, those men die. I need to know this is real. Patton looked Eisenhower in the eye. I've been planning this operation for 11 days. Third Army is already disengaging. The plans are complete. Routes are calculated. Fuel is positioned. I can attack with the 4th Armoured Division and 26th Infantry Division within 48 hours. We will break through to Bastogne. The room went quiet for a different reason now. 11 days. Patton had been preparing for this before the attack even happened. While Supreme Headquarters was dismissing intelligence warnings, Patton had been planning the response. The other generals didn't know whether to be impressed or angry that Patton had apparently ignored official intelligence assessments and prepared on his own initiative. Eisenhower made the decision. Do it. You have 48 hours. Patton nodded and left immediately. He didn't need to stay for further discussion. His staff had been waiting for this authorization. The plans were ready. Now came execution. As Patton walked out, he sent a 2-word coded message to his headquarters. Play ball. Those 2 words initiated the largest, fastest military redeployment of the entire European campaign. The movement was extraordinary by any measure. 133,000 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, artillery pieces, ambulances, support vehicles. Over 100,000 men from multiple divisions, all moving simultaneously through a blizzard on roads barely adequate for peacetime traffic, with German air attacks possible despite weather through terrain clogged with retreating American units, fleeing refugees, and wounded being evacuated. Military police worked around the clock directing traffic at every intersection. Engineers cleared roads, built bypasses around destroyed bridges, laid corduroy roads across muddy fields that would bog down heavy vehicles. Supply trucks ran constant shuttles, delivering fuel, ammunition, and rations to units on the move. The 4th Armoured Division led the advance, their Sherman tanks grinding through snow and ice. Behind them came the 26th Infantry Division, soldiers marching through freezing temperatures in conditions that would normally halt all military operations. And they didn't slow down. Day and night, the columns kept moving. When vehicles broke down, they were pushed off the road and left behind. When soldiers collapsed from exhaustion, they were loaded onto trucks and others took their place. The tempo was relentless because Patton had calculated every hour. 48 hours to launch the attack meant zero time for delays, for rest, for anything except movement. By December 21st, just over 48 hours after Eisenhower gave authorization, lead elements of the Third Army were in position near Bastogne. They'd covered over 100 miles in less than 2 days, through conditions that should have made movement impossible. December 22nd. The counterattack launched on schedule, exactly as Patton promised. The fighting was brutal. German forces weren't expecting an attack from the south so quickly. They'd assumed American forces would need at least a week to respond. The speed of Patton's assault caught them unprepared, but they fought back fiercely. Tank battles in frozen fields, infantry assaults through snow-covered forests, artillery duels that turned quiet Belgian villages into smoking ruins. Every mile gained cost casualties. Every hour brought American forces closer to the besieged paratroopers in Bastogne. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was holding despite desperate conditions. Ammunition critically low, medical supplies exhausted, wounded soldiers dying from exposure because there weren't enough intact buildings to shelter everyone. German attacks came constantly, probing for weaknesses, trying to force surrender before relief arrived. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the defence. McAuliffe's response became legendary. One word: nuts. When German officers asked for clarification, American negotiators explained it meant go to hell. The defenders of Bastogne would hold. They knew Patton was coming. They just had to survive long enough. December 26th, 1650 hours. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 4th Armoured Division led his tanks through German positions near Assenois and made physical contact with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. Patton immediately called Eisenhower with the news. The relief had succeeded exactly as promised. The corridor to Bastogne was narrow, constantly under German attack, and would remain contested for weeks. But the strategic moment had passed. The Germans had failed to take Bastogne. Their offensive stalled. The momentum shifted to the Allies, and it shifted because Patton had delivered on an impossible promise. Except it wasn't impossible. It was just impossible for anyone who hadn't prepared. The Battle of the Bulge would rage until late January 1945. It became the bloodiest engagement American forces fought in the European theatre. Over 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. The human cost was staggering, but it could have been catastrophically worse. If Bastogne had fallen, the German offensive might have reached the Meuse River. The Allied front could have been split. The war could have extended months or years longer. Instead, German forces were stopped, surrounded, and systematically destroyed. The Ardennes offensive became Germany's last major attack in the West. After the Bulge, German forces were permanently on the defensive, retreating toward Germany and eventual defeat. The turning point was Bastogne, and Bastogne held because Patton relieved it in 48 hours. A timeline everyone thought was impossible. Post-war investigations into how the Battle of the Bulge caught Allies by surprise revealed uncomfortable truths. The intelligence wasn't missing, it was dismissed. Multiple sources had warned of German preparations: radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, civilian reports, photographic reconnaissance, all pointed to a major offensive being prepared in the Ardennes. But senior Allied commanders, convinced the war was essentially won, rejected intelligence that contradicted their assumptions. They wanted to believe Germany was beaten, so they interpreted all evidence through that lens. Warnings became German propaganda designed to create fear. Troop movements became routine repositioning of reserves. The concentration of forces became defensive preparations. At every level, intelligence was filtered through optimistic bias until only confirmation of existing beliefs remained. Oscar Koch's analysis was thorough, evidence-based, and accurate. His prediction of the timing, location, and scale of the German offensive was remarkably precise, but his warnings went nowhere beyond Patton because higher commands weren't listening. This wasn't a failure of intelligence gathering, it was a failure of intelligence consumption. The information existed. It was rejected because accepting it required changing comfortable assumptions about the war's trajectory. Koch understood this. In his post-war writings, he noted that intelligence officers can provide perfect analysis and still be ignored if commanders have already decided what they want to believe. The relationship between Patton and Koch reveals something critical about leadership and intelligence. Patton wasn't an intelligence expert. He couldn't have produced Koch's analysis himself, but he recognized that Koch was an expert and trusted his judgment even when it contradicted official assessments. That trust allowed Patton to prepare while others were complacent. The 11 days of invisible preparation made 48 hours of visible action possible. Military historians studying the Battle of the Bulge often focus on the combat. The heroic defense of Bastogne, the rapid relief operation, the eventual Allied victory. All of that is important, but the real story starts 11 days earlier with an intelligence officer nobody's heard of, telling a general something that general didn't want to hear, and that general believing him anyway. Because Patton understood a fundamental truth about warfare. Battles are won or lost before the first shot is fired. Preparation, intelligence, planning, these unglamorous activities determine outcomes far more than courage or firepower. You can't be brave enough to overcome being unprepared. You can't fight hard enough to compensate for being surprised. The side that sees the battle coming and prepares wins. The side that's caught off guard loses. It's that simple. December 19th, Verdun. When Patton said 48 hours, other generals thought he was guessing or exaggerating. He was doing neither. He was stating a fact based on 11 days of meticulous preparation. The plans existed. The routes were calculated. The fuel was positioned. The timeline was verified. All that remained was execution. And Patton's Third Army excelled at execution because they'd practiced the operation in planning before executing it in reality. The other generals couldn't promise similar timelines because they hadn't done the preparation. You can't move an army 100 miles in 2 days without planning exactly how to do it, step by step, hour by hour. Improvisation works for small operations. Large-scale military movements require detailed planning or they collapse into chaos. Patton knew this. His staff knew this. They'd spent 11 days building the machine that would run in 48 hours. When the moment came, they activated what they'd already built rather than trying to build something new under pressure. That's the difference between readiness and reaction. Reaction is always too slow. Readiness is preparation meeting opportunity. Patton was ready because Koch warned him and he believed the warning. The legacy of the Battle of the Bulge extends far beyond 1944. Military institutions worldwide study it as a case study in surprise attacks, intelligence failures, and rapid response operations. But the lessons go deeper than tactics. The Bulge teaches that institutional consensus can be wrong, that experts can be dismissed when they contradict comfortable narratives, that preparation before crisis is more valuable than heroism during crisis, that the person who sees danger coming and prepares is worth more than 100 who fight bravely after being surprised. Oscar Koch never became famous. Most people interested in World War II have never heard his name. He didn't command troops in combat. He didn't win battles directly. He sat in an office analyzing intelligence reports and making predictions. Unglamorous work, invisible work. work that saved thousands of lives because one general listened to him when everyone else dismissed his warnings. The real heroes of Bastogne aren't just the paratroopers who held under impossible conditions, or the tankers who broke through to relieve them. The real heroes include a quiet intelligence officer who saw what was coming and a general who believed him enough to act. The 48-hour promise that shocked the room at Verdun wasn't bravado. It was the culmination of 11 days of work nobody saw. Patton gets credit for the relief of Bastogne because he commanded the operation. That credit is deserved. But the operation was possible because Koch provided warning and Patton acted on it, while everyone else ignored similar warnings. The Battle of the Bulge could have been prevented entirely if Allied command had believed their own intelligence and prepared defences in the Ardennes. It wasn't prevented because optimism overruled evidence. But once the battle started, it could have ended in disaster if relief hadn't arrived quickly. It didn't end in disaster because one general had spent 11 days preparing for exactly this scenario. 48 hours. The timeline everyone thought was impossible. Impossible for anyone who hadn't prepared, routine for someone who had. That's the lesson. Wars aren't won by last-minute heroics. They're won by preparation nobody notices until crisis reveals who was ready and who wasn't. December 16, 1944, the German offensive exposed which Allied commanders had been paying attention to intelligence and which had been assuming everything would be fine. Only one was ready, only one had prepared, only one could promise 48 hours and deliver. When veterans of the 101st Airborne talked about their relief after the war, they spoke about seeing Patton's tanks break through German lines with profound relief and gratitude. They'd been hours from running out of ammunition. The Germans were preparing a final assault. Surrender or annihilation were the only options left. Then American tanks appeared, and suddenly they had a chance. Those paratroopers owed their lives to Patton's Third Army. But more fundamentally, they owed their lives to 11 days of preparation that happened before they were even surrounded. If Koch hadn't warned Patton on December 9th, if Patton hadn't believed the warning, if Third Army staff hadn't prepared detailed contingency plans, the 48-hour relief would have been genuinely impossible. The relief would have taken a week or more. By then, Bastogne would have fallen. The 101 would have been destroyed or captured. The German offensive might have succeeded strategically. The war could have lasted months longer. None of that happened because one intelligence officer did his job excellently and one general trusted him completely. That's worth remembering. The phrase, "why Patton was the only general ready," isn't about Patton being smarter or braver than other Allied commanders. It's about Patton being the only one who listened to intelligence that contradicted comfortable assumptions. Every Allied general had access to similar intelligence. The reports about German troop movements were distributed throughout the command structure. But only Koch at Third Army put the pieces together correctly, and only Patton acted on Koch's analysis. That combination, excellent intelligence analysis plus command willingness to act on it, made Third Army uniquely prepared. Remove either element and the readiness disappears. If Koch hadn't been thorough, his warnings would have been vague and easily dismissed. If Patton hadn't trusted Koch, the warnings would have been ignored like they were everywhere else. Both elements were necessary. Both elements were present only in Patton's command. That's why Patton was ready when everyone else was caught off guard. December 19th, Verdun. Patton's 48-hour promise seemed impossible because everyone else was starting from zero. Patton was starting from 11 days of preparation. When you've already done the work, execution is just following the plan. When you haven't done the work, execution is improvisation under pressure. Improvisation fails more often than it succeeds. Patton succeeded because he'd eliminated the need to improvise. The Battle of the Bulge was America's bloodiest battle in the European theatre. Thousands died, tens of thousands were wounded. The suffering was immense, but it could have been vastly worse. If Allied command had listened to intelligence warnings, prepared defences, and met the German offensive ready instead of surprised, casualties would have been lower. The battle might have been avoided entirely. That didn't happen because institutions rejected intelligence that contradicted desired narratives. But once the battle started, rapid response minimized damage. That happened because one command had prepared. The contradiction is instructive. Institutional failure created the crisis. Individual excellence limited the damage. Both lessons matter. Don't ignore intelligence. And if crisis comes anyway, having someone ready makes all the difference. Patton was ready. His readiness saved an army. His willingness to believe warnings others dismissed made that readiness possible. And Oscar Koch's intelligence work provided the warnings that made preparation possible. The chain of causation runs: Koch's analysis, Patton's trust, Third Army's preparation, 48-hour response, relief of Bastogne, limiting German offensive, Allied victory. Break any link and the outcome changes. Every link held because people did their jobs excellently, even when institutional pressure pushed toward complacency. The story of Bastogne, when told correctly, isn't just about courage under fire. It's about foresight before crisis. It's about an intelligence officer nobody's heard of seeing what was coming. It's about a general, controversial and difficult trusting that intelligence officer over institutional consensus. It's about 11 days of unsexy planning work that enabled 48 hours of dramatic action. It's about preparation mattering more than heroism. It's about being ready before you need to be ready, because once you need to be ready, it's too late to prepare. Patton was the only general ready for the Battle of the Bulge because he was the only one who'd spent 11 days preparing for it. The preparation happened in silence. The results happened in public. The preparation mattered more. That's the real lesson, the real story, the real reason 48 hours was possible. Not because Patton was superhuman, because he was prepared. And preparation, invisible and unglamorous as it is, wins wars.